Methamphetamine. Can you imagine your body becoming a battlefield where the enemy is not outside but crawling restlessly inside your belly? That was the nightmare a man in Kentucky had to face, not in a dream, but in the very last moments of his life when methamphetamine had taken over his mind. He began like many other people who used meth, seeking a dose to prolong the feeling of alertness, to push his body beyond natural limits, to feel strong, tireless, and invincible. However, instead of euphoria, what he received was a dense series of hallucinations. In his eyes, his flesh was no longer intact. Beneath that layer of skin was a lair where monstrous snakes crawled, twisted, and prepared to burst through his organs from the inside. In a delirious frenzy, this man believed that if he did not do something immediately, those monsters would explode out of his belly and kill him. His trembling hands held a kitchen knife. In his mind, everything made sense. He had to open his stomach, he had to drag those snakes out. He no longer felt normal pain. Meth had numbed the nerves, had ignited hallucinations into reality. One slash, then another, and then a long cut tore across his abdomen. Blood spurted out, spreading across the floor. He screamed, both horrified and satisfied, as if he were truly pulling something out of his body. But what spilled outside was only intestines, the stomach, pieces of internal organs gasping in the open air. There were no snakes at all, only his own body falling apart. He shoved his hands inside, trying to pull something out, trying to prove to himself that there was an enemy within. When the police stormed in, they found him collapsed on the floor, his entrails protruding, his eyes still wide open in the final hallucination. Neighbors later recounted that before this, he had wandered around the neighborhood, shouting about snakes crawling inside his stomach. No one thought that delusion would end with such a grotesque scene. But that is what meth can do. Turn an ordinary man into someone who tears his own body apart in a maddened delusion. Finally, as too much blood drained, he grew exhausted. The screams weakened, turning into faint whispers. His eyes dimmed, his breath quickened, and then ceased completely. In his mind, perhaps the thought still echoed that he had fought, that he had defeated those phantom snakes. But in reality, the killer was not the snakes, but the meth that had opened the gates of hell inside his mind. It was a horrifying death, one that people could not forget for many years afterward. And this was only one of countless endings that drugs can bring. LSD. In 1969 in New York, a young man turned to LSD with the belief that this small piece of paper would open a more beautiful world. He wanted to drift away, to see colors blend together, to feel music flowing through his veins. And at first, he got exactly that. The walls trembled as if breathing. The ceiling melted into waves, and ordinary melodies turned into glowing halos. But as the dose rose higher, the vision changed. The room was no longer an ordinary apartment, but transformed into a fiery abyss. Imaginary cracks split the floor apart, flames erupting and swallowing the world. In his mind, this was the end of humanity, and he was the chosen one to save it all. In the middle of his hallucination, a voice echoed inside his head. If you want to save everyone, you must sacrifice yourself. A simple sentence, but to a mind intoxicated by LSD, it became an absolute truth. He nodded, stood up, and stepped out onto the balcony. In his dazzled eyes, the steel railing was no longer a foolish barrier, but a gateway to the sky. Far away, the city lights mixed with the night, shimmering like heaven itself. And he jumped. In that instant, the wind roared in his ears, clothes flapping wildly. In his mind, perhaps it felt as if he were truly flying, like a hero from a comic book. But the only thing waiting below was not cheering crowds, but cold pavement. The impact ended everything. Bones shattered, blood spread, a clean and merciless ending. Residents rushed out, some screaming, others frozen in shock. They said his face still carried a smile, frozen between blood and concrete, making the scene even more grotesque. One witness muttered, "Looked like he thought he was Superman. Just too bad he flew straight down." A remark half mocking, half chilling, leaving the crowd both uneasy and horrified. The forensic record later stated plainly, death from falling from a height while under LSD hallucination. But in the memory of those who witnessed it, this was one of the deaths so horrifying and bizarre that it was hard to believe. LSD had turned an ordinary apartment into the end of the world, and turned an anonymous young man into the tragic hero of his own delusion. The story left behind a chilling paradox. LSD expands the mind, but sometimes it also opens the shortest path straight to the ground. Cocaine. Some deaths do not come from a blade or a bullet, but from fear itself inside the mind. Cocaine, the white powder once praised as the energy of the elite, is also the door to a nightmare called paranoia, a delusion powerful enough to turn an ordinary room into a labyrinth of demons. A man in Colombia in 2007 was proof of that. At first, he turned to cocaine to feel stronger, to gain confidence, to prove that he was invincible at endless parties. And indeed, at first he felt like he was flying, every thought sharp, his body buzzing with electricity. But that excitement was quickly replaced by nameless terror. In his eyes, the shadows around the house were no longer the shadows of furniture, but enemies. A faint sound outside the door became the footsteps of assassins. Cars passing by outside suddenly turned into convoys of police ready to storm in. The entire world, in his mind, had turned against him, surrounding him, hunting him down. In panic, he ran around the room, slamming doors, pulling curtains, overturning everything. He screamed that they are coming, his voice hoarse, eyes darting. But the they existed only in his mind. With cocaine, paranoia needs no evidence. It only needs a spark to burn away reason. And then the fear escalated. With no way out, he threw himself headfirst into the wall. Once. Then again. Blood spread, his forehead split, but he did not stop. In his mind, the wall was the enemy, and he had to break through it to escape. Neighbors heard the loud banging and thought the house was being demolished. But when they rushed over, they saw only a man smashing his head against concrete until his face was unrecognizable. It was not a battle, but a self-inflicted execution, with both the killer and the victim being the same man. Eventually, his body could take no more. His skull shattered, blood and brain matter splattered across the floor. He collapsed, his eyes still wide open, as if in his hallucination he still saw invisible enemies circling around him. That death was recorded in the forensic file in dry, detached words. Death from cranial trauma in a state of acute cocaine-induced paranoia. But for those who saw it with their own eyes, the image could not be erased. A man turned into a self-destroying monster. A room turned into the stage of a grotesque hallucination. PCP, angel dust. If meth plants hallucinations, LSD turns the world into a nightmare, and cocaine drowns people in paranoia, then PCP, angel dust, plants a strange belief that you are immortal. But when a mortal body collides with reality, that belief is quickly crushed, literally. A young man in California in the grip of PCP believed his skin was made of steel. He screamed in the street, raised his fists, and shouted that nothing could kill him. Onlookers thought he was just a drunk, but the truth was different. PCP had taken his brain, dulled his pain to almost nothing, and erased his reason entirely. He stepped out onto the crowded highway, chest thrust forward, shouting, "I am immortal!" In his eyes, the blinding headlights of oncoming cars weren't danger, but an opportunity to prove himself. The first truck slammed its brakes, tires screeching against the asphalt. But he stood there, arms wide open, as if waiting for the embrace of a god. When the impact hit, his body was thrown high into the air, then crashed to the ground like a sack of sand. Witnesses screamed, but somehow he crawled up again, blood streaming, grinning with delight. In his hallucination, the collision didn't prove his fragility. It confirmed his belief that he could not die. So he ran again, this time straight into the front of an SUV speeding over 60 miles per hour. That impact left no second chance. His body was torn apart, blood and bones splattering across the windshield. Pieces of flesh scattered meters away. The scene was chaos. The driver screaming in panic, bystanders frozen in disbelief at what they had just seen. One witness said with a trembling voice, "He looked like he wanted to prove he was Superman." But in reality, it was like watching a doll being crushed by a truck. A remark half mocking, half haunting, carved into the memory of everyone there that day. The forensic report recorded the death in dry words. Body completely destroyed by vehicular impact, victim in a state of PCP intoxication. But no line in that report could capture the sheer horror of that moment. A young man turning the highway into a stage, turning the illusion of immortality into a grotesque suicide. That death closed like a silent film, without music, only the cold echo of tires screeching on asphalt. PCP had turned an anonymous young man into a hero in his own eyes, then crushed him in the very role he tried to play.